Rick Ness had one shot left, and he was about to bet everything on ground that everyone else had already walked away from. No backup plan, no safety net, just a man, a crew that wasn't sure he was right, and a piece of land called Vegas Valley that had a reputation for swallowing careers. If you've ever wondered what it actually looks like when a mine boss runs out of easy options, this is that story, and it's still playing out right now. Stick around, because the ending of this season is far from decided, and if you want every twist the moment it happens, subscribe and turn on notifications, because Gold Rush is only getting more unpredictable from here. By the time this season of Gold Rush picked back up, Rick Ness was already carrying more pressure than almost anyone else on the show. He'd left Lightning Creek behind him, a claim that had cost him money and time without giving him the kind of season-defining haul he needed. He'd chased ground before that hadn't paid off the way he hoped, and every viewer who had followed him since his days on Parker Schnabel's crew knew exactly what was riding on his next move. Rick built his name as the guy who worked his way up from operator to owner, the underdog of the franchise, the one who didn't inherit a mining empire but built one cut at a time. That story only works as long as the gold keeps coming. And heading back into Vegas Valley, a piece of ground that had already been labeled dangerous and unreliable by more experienced hands, Rick wasn't chasing a good season anymore. He was fighting to prove he still belonged to the table with Tony Beets and Parker Schnabel, two operations that were both having monster years, while Rick's crew waited for a breakthrough that hadn't come yet. Vegas Valley wasn't new to Rick. He'd worked pieces of it before, and he knew the ground had gold in it. What he didn't know, not for certain, was whether it had enough gold in the right place to justify the kind of investment he was about to make. The math on a placer operation is brutal and unforgiving. Every acre you strip costs diesel, costs labor, costs were on machines that are already tired from years of Klondike winners. You don't get that investment back unless the pay dirt underneath is rich enough to cover it, and then some. Rick's plan wasn't modest. He gathered his crew and laid out an expansion that would push the cut 4 acres wider and require moving more than 1 million yards of overburden in just 6 weeks. For a smaller operation without the fleet size of Tony's or the manpower of Parker's, that is an enormous commitment of time, fuel, and machine hours, all riding on ground that hadn't yet proven it could pay for itself. What made the moment land so hard wasn't just the size of the plan. It was what Rick told his crew, standing right there in front of them. He didn't sell it as one option among several. He said flatly, "This is the only option we have." That's not the kind of thing a mine boss says when there's a comfortable fallback waiting in his back pocket. It's the kind of thing you say when the alternative is watching your operation run out of ground, out of runway, and out of time before the season closes. Rick has always operated with less margin for error than Tony or Parker. He doesn't have decades of established, proven claims to fall back on the way Tony does at Paradise Hill or the Indian River ground Parker has spent years developing. Every big swing Rick takes is closer to all-in than either of the bigger operations ever have to be, and that's exactly what made this expansion feel different from the moment he announced it. He gave a new push a name, Valhalla. It's a pull from Norse mythology, the hall where warriors who die in battle are carried to be honored, and Rick borrowed it from Metal's song by the band Storm Warrior. It's a small detail, but it tells you something about how Rick was framing this moment for himself and for his crew. This wasn't just another cut. It was being treated like a final stand. Win or lose completely, with nothing held back. Naming a piece of ground like that puts a certain weight on it before a single bucket of dirt has even been moved, and Rick knew that. His crew knew it too. And while the show captured some real skepticism among the operators about whether the numbers would actually work out, they got behind him anyway, because at that point in the season, getting behind him was the only path forward they had left either. The early work on Valhalla started at pace. Crews pushed to strip toward bedrock, moving through the overburden with the kind of urgency that only comes when a 6-week clock is running, and every day of delay eats directly into whatever profit the ground might eventually deliver. In placer mining, speed during the strip phase isn't optional. Every day spent moving waste rock is a day not spent processing pay dirt through the wash plant. And pay dirt is the only thing that actually turns into gold in the cleanup. Rick's team leaned into that reality hard. working to get down to bedrock as efficiently as they could, because the 6-week window he'd promised his crew wasn't a soft target. It was the difference between a season that recovers and one that doesn't. But Placer Ground in the Klondike rarely gives up its secrets without a fight, and Rick's operation ran directly into one of the oldest problems in the business. As the strip progressed, the crew hit a layer of clay roughly 30 feet down, and that kind of obstruction isn't a minor inconvenience. Clay can seal off access to the gold-bearing gravel underneath it, slow excavators to a crawl, and in some cases stop a cut from producing anything at all until it's cleared or a different approach is found. For an operation already working against a strict 6-week deadline and a very public commitment that this was the only option left, a 30-foot clay layer showing up partway through the push was about as bad a break as Rick could have drawn. It didn't just cost time. It threatened the entire premise of the plan, because a cut that can't reach paid dirt in the remaining weeks of the season isn't a gamble anymore. It's a loss already locked in. That setback forced Rick into one of the harder decisions of his career on the show. Rather than continue fighting a piece of ground that had turned uncooperative right when he needed it most, he made the call to step away from the Valhalla push and pivot back towards salvaging what he could elsewhere on his claim, including a return to working sections of Vegas Valley outside the failed cut. It's worth sitting with how difficult that decision actually is for someone in Rick's position. Walking away from an investment you've already sunk real money and real time into is one of the hardest calls any operator has to make, because it means admitting the bet didn't pay off in front of a crew who believe in the plan and in front of an audience who watched you call it your only option. But continuing to chase ground that has already shown you it isn't going to deliver in the time you have left is often the faster way to lose everything. Rick chose to cut his losses on Valhalla rather than let it consume the rest of his season, and that decision, as unglamorous as it looks compared to a triumphant strike, is often the one that actually separates operators who survive a bad season from ones who don't. While all of this was unfolding, Rick wasn't operating in a vacuum. The rest of the gold rush world was watching, and some of that attention came with actual leverage attached. Parker Schnabel, who has known Rick since the earliest days when Rick worked as one of his operators before striking out on his own, made his interest in Rick's operation known directly. With the Valhalla cut no longer viable and Vegas Valley still an open question, Parker raised the idea of a buyout, and he didn't do it quietly. He told Rick plainly that Tony Beets wouldn't pay what the operation was actually worth, framing his own offer as the better deal on the table. It's a pointed thing to say to someone you came up with in the business, and it put Rick in an uncomfortable spot. Tony Beets, for his part, had also approached Rick separately about the possibility of buying in or buying out, which meant Rick wasn't just fighting for gold anymore. He was fielding real interest from two of the biggest operators in the Klondike, both of whom clearly saw value in his ground, even while his own season was struggling to find its footing. Rick didn't take either offer. He kept things deliberately open, telling both men essentially the same thing, that he wasn't ready to commit to anything permanent while there was still gold left to chase this season. That's a telling response from someone who, on paper, looked like he was cornered. A buyout would have solved his immediate cash problem and ended the uncertainty hanging over Vegas Valley. But it also would have meant giving up the very thing Rick has spent his entire career on the show building toward, which is being an owner, not an employee, and running his own operation on his own terms, even when those terms are brutally hard. Choosing to keep fighting instead of cashing out is consistent with everything we've watched from Rick since he first left Parker's crew to strike out on his own ground. It's not the safe choice. It's the one that keeps the door open for the outcome he actually wants, which is proving Vegas Valley can pay off under his own management. With the buyout offer set aside for the moment, the focus shifted back to the practical, unglamorous work of getting Vegas Valley producing again. Equipment problems compounded the pressure, and Rick had to make hard calls about repairs and upgrades with a shrinking budget and a shrinking calendar. Every dollar spent on machinery is a dollar not available for payroll or fuel, and every day a machine sits broken down is a day the crew isn't moving dirt. Rick negotiated hard on parts and equipment where he could, squeezing value out of every deal because he genuinely couldn't afford not to. None of this is the dramatic, cinematic version of a gold rush story. There's no single triumphant nugget pulled out of sluice box that instantly fixes everything. It's slower than that, and harder than that, which is exactly why it's worth paying attention to. The real tension in Rick's season isn't whether he'll find one big score. It's whether an operation running this close to the edge can keep making the right calls often enough, fast enough, to still be standing when the season ends. As of the most recent episodes, that question remains genuinely open. Vegas Valley has shown signs of promise in places, enough to justify Rick's decision to keep working it rather than fold his hand entirely. But it hasn't yet delivered the kind of season-saving haul that would put the earlier setbacks fully behind him. The clock that started with that 6-week promise back at the beginning of the Valhalla push has kept running the whole time, and every week that passes narrows the margin for what's still possible before the season closes out. Rick's situation sits in a genuinely uncertain place right now, caught between real interest from two much larger operators who would clearly like to bring his ground into their own operations, and Rick's own determination to prove that Vegas Valley can pay off under his ownership if he's given the time to work it properly. What makes this particular stretch of Rick's story worth following closely isn't the promise of an easy win. It's the opposite. This is what it actually looks like when a smaller operator goes head-to-head against the two biggest names in modern placer mining without the same size fleet, the same decades of proven ground, or the same margin for a bad break. Tony Beets is having one of the biggest years of his career banking millions off Paradise Hill and the corner cut. Parker Schnabel is chasing a 10,000-ounce season with a 4-plant operation running at full tilt. And Rick is out at Vegas Valley, 30 feet down through a layer of clay that nearly ended a season before it really started, trying to prove that the underdog path he's walked since leaving Parker's crew still has one more chapter worth telling. Whether that chapter ends with Rick pulling off the recovery or ends with him finally taking one of those buyout offers is genuinely still unwritten. And that uncertainty, more than any single number or any single cleanup, is what makes this the storyline worth watching for the rest of the season. To really understand why this particular gamble carries so much weight, it helps to step back and look at where Rick started. He didn't come up through a family operation the way Tony's sons did, and he didn't inherit decades of proven Klondike, ground the way Parker eventually built on top of his grandfather's foundation. Rick worked his way onto Parker's crew as an operator, learning the trade from the ground up, running equipment for someone else's vision before he ever got the chance to chase his own. When he finally struck out with his own claim, he did it without the built-in cushion that comes from generational mining knowledge or an existing fleet of proven, paid-off machines. Every excavator, every wash plant upgrade, every acre of new ground Rick has taken on since then has been financed through the previous season's results, which means a single bad year doesn't just hurt his numbers. It can genuinely threaten whether there's a next season at all. That's the backdrop that makes the Valhalla decision so much heavier than it might look on the surface. Tony can absorb a rough cut because he's got Paradise Hill and the corner cut and years of accumulated equity behind him. Parker can absorb a stumble because his operation runs multiple wash plants simultaneously across different pieces of ground. Rick doesn't have that same redundancy built in. So when he tells his crew this is the only option we have, there's a real chance that statement is closer to literal truth than dramatic framing.